All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Joeri from the Money Macro channel, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar about Ben Bernanke's Bank of England review, in which he criticizes the bank's unwieldy framework and recommends that they put in more weights on different scenarios rather than a single baseline prediction, and that they improve their communications to the public with this. And I think this is really timely because these are core aspects of what the central banks of Armenia and Georgia have been working on all along in their new evolution of the forecasting and policy analysis system known as FPAS Mark II. So to talk about all of this, I'm very happy to say that for this session, we have a great roster of speakers. First, we have Armen Nurbekyan, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, and Doc Laxton from the Better Policy Project, who will give us an overview of the history of FPAS at the Central Bank of Armenia, with an emphasis on human capital. And then we have Shalva Mkhatriashvili. I hope I pronounced the surname correctly. Please correct me on that when it's your turn to speak, who heads the macro department at the National Bank of Georgia. And the talk will be about the experience of the National Bank of Georgia in shaping FPAS Mark II for a variant where the case where the governor is the primary decision maker. And finally, to round it all off, we have Professor Charles Goodhart with us, who advised the Bank of England about monetary policy for many, many years. And he will round off the discussion by giving his perspective on the points made by the previous panelists, as well as Bernanke's report. And after that, we have time for an extensive question and answer session. So, without further ado, I give the floor first to Armen Nurbekyan.
Thanks very much, Joeri. A really good pleasure to be on this panel. I think I haven't read, a document on monetary policy with such a pleasure for a long time. So I thought it was very, very interesting what Bernanke did. So the focus of my talk, which is going to be around 10 to 15 minutes, is going to be how do we see the main issues and how we saw the main issues at the Central Bank of Armenia when we were designing the monetary policy framework, and what are the similarities with compared to what Bernanke is suggesting for the Bank of England, and what are the things that we took a bit of a different path. And I think I'm gonna pass the ball to Doug to talk about different approaches to some of the problems that Bernanke was thinking about. And let me start with the broad problem definition, then what was the problem that we were really tackling at the Central Bank of Armenia. And in short, the main issue was, how do we design a monetary policy framework? And here, when I mean framework, when I say framework, I mean both internal processes, external communications, decision-making. So the overall decision-making framework of monetary policy to deal with the situation when you have a very, very uncertain environment. And for a small open economy like Armenia, which is located in a very unstable region, this is not a theoretical exercise. This is something that we have to tackle every day. So this was really the main issue. Armenia obviously has been an inflation targeting central bank from 2006. We had the so-called FPAS, forecasting and policy analysis system, for more than 10 years before we had to switch to a new decision-making model. And also, for the sake of information for the participants, at the Central Bank of Armenia, we have a board decision-making model, which is not consensus-based. So there is a very important emphasis on individual responsibility of the board members. And this is very important to keep in mind. Now, I was very pleased to read Bernanke's report, because I think the main, one of the main emphasis that he has put is obviously on the importance of talking about the risks, developing alternative scenarios, and what is the connection with the transparency and the communication with the markets. And the FPAS Mark II, which is the approach that Central Bank of Armenia took, the real main innovation is to put in a practical use the so-called prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, which you can see on the slides, right? And on the slide, you can see the first report that we actually published, the monetary policy report, which has this approach, which emphasizes alternative scenarios, but basically we call them case A and case B scenarios. In case A, this is the scenario which shows what are the relevant risks compared to the market reference scenario, compared to what market expects. What is the scenario which could show how the central bank would react in case we would have a higher interest rate compared to the market reference rate to bring inflation back to the target. And case B is basically the other risk, which is what if the opposite takes place and we have more low deflation or lower inflation scenarios, compared to what market expects. So what this does is basically shows the market how does the central bank think about policy making in a transparent way. So I think this was a clear emphasis, also a bit different shades, but in the Bernanke's report in terms of importance of discussing different scenarios. And in case of Armenia, obviously, this was a key important point for us in terms of operationalizing this approach, which is not easy. And to be fair, Alan Greenspan was the person in 2004, I think, who first talked about prudent risk management approach. So we didn't come up with this idea per se. So he, in his speech, basically outlined that the monetary policy making is not really about just coming up with one scenario and putting all the eggs in one basket and basically betting that would happen and designing a monetary policy based on that. But in real life, when you have an uncertain environment, what the policymakers do, they actually weigh different scenarios. What are the possible mistakes and associated policy errors and costs compared in that scenarios, right? So that's the real life. So what we did is actually try to operationalize in real life both internal processes and external communication to actually deliver this, right? Because we know that there's very, very heavy reliance on baseline scenarios in the world, in all the central banks, which we think is creating big problems for central banks to do the right things. Now, when I talk about the framework, there are several important aspects that I want to discuss, and I think Bernanke also has these aspects in his report. One is something which I already talked about, baseline versus alternatives. But the second one is really the transparency, which is very important, right? Because when we were discussing the framework and that we don't want to publish a single baseline, and then everybody was one of the main communication challenges and one of the main challenges that people basically talked about was that, is this really a discretion? Is this really just avoiding a responsibility of publishing something which is a baseline forecast? And isn't this basically going to undermine the transparency because you are not actually telling what is on your mind, right? And here I see Bob Ford is here, so I'm gonna quote him because I think he gave me the best definition of transparency, which is very simple, because the way that we talk about transparency and think about transparency at the central bank is not really throwing information at people, right? What you want to do is give them an idea, how are you really making a decision, right? So instead of having just nice graphs with lots of details, what you want to do, you want to make sure that you communicate properly how in real life you're actually making a decision so that the markets and public at large understand what you are doing. Right? So it's not doing something internally and then communicating something else externally, right? Transparency is really about people understanding what you are doing, how you're making a decision. So the key point here is that if you take the definition, then the next question is, okay, how are the banks really making a decision? Are they just talking about one baseline scenario, or are they talking about many scenarios and weighing the risks associated with these scenarios and possible policy errors? In all the central banks I have been, everybody is really talking about different scenarios. When the time is very uncertain, I'm more certain that they are talking about much more scenarios. And I think this is the key thing. So connecting this to Bob's definition of transparency, The key takeaway that I have is to design a system which actually conveys this information of decision making to the market. Because if this is the way you are making a decision, then your responsibility is to convey this in the right way to the market so they understand how you're making a decision. If at a central bank they're making a decision based on a baseline scenario, then by all means, they should communicate that to the market. So I think this is very, very important. And I understand that the markets always wants more specific one-lines. It's easier to interpret. It gives this nice one-line summary. But the point that I want to make, if that is not the case, that the banks are making their decision based on that one scenario, then we shouldn't go for easy answers. We should try to tackle the real problem. So I think this is the one key point that we have been talking about, and this is why we thought it's not really discretionary; it's actually more transparent. And I want to bring back to this discussion Bernanke's point, because this is exactly what he mentioned in one of his points. Because what he said was basically that, given that the central bank could actually communicate several risks and then explain how would monetary policy operate if that risk is operationalized, this is actually going to be more transparent than compared to one baseline, because markets would understand what the central bank would do if the scenarios or risks materialize. So I think this is something which Bernanke put in his paper, and this is something that I wanted to talk about, because this was the main challenge. People were telling us this is going to be less transparent, and I think this point is very, very important. Second, which is very important also, is the internal organization. How do you organize staff? And what are the implications of having these alternative scenarios versus baseline scenario in terms of the internal organization of the monetary policy departments or whatever you have in the particular bank? And I think here as well, Bernanke was, I think, putting right emphasis on many things. But here we actually have some disagreements in in the path that we took, which I'm gonna talk about a bit. But I think the one of the key points. First, let me start with things that we agree on. One of the key points that we were making is that the overemphasizing the baseline scenario is actually leading to a very inefficient use of resources within the central banks. Right? And the point was, especially in our context, that you have board, in our case, 8 people, which have to discuss these scenarios and then vote. If you put, so much emphasis on the baseline forecast, then all the focus of the monetary policy making process inside the central bank is actually, all the resources are going to, creating a consensus between 8 board members. Right, so all the resources of the staff is basically trying to to find a line which makes every board member least unhappy, right? I think this, and so there is so much resourcing going into it that in fact nobody is really focusing, or nobody has time to actually construct these risk scenarios. And there is no co-creation process, but there is basically the competition process between the board members, because there is this unconscious or a conscious point that if you want your points to be taken into account for decision-making process, then you have to make sure that your points are in the baseline scenario, right? So when you create this competition, that board members start to fight to put their points in the baseline scenario. So this is the key problem, which puts so much emphasis on the on that one line, and I think this is extremely inefficient. And Bernanke actually had talked about this, and here I'm quoting, which I thought a very important point. This is the quote: "Without objecting to scenarios in principle, in our conversations, some staff expressed concerns that producing these scenarios could be time intensive and the drain on the time they have available to develop the central forecast and engage with the MPC." So this is the end of the quote. So I think this was the point, because when he was talking about this with the staff basically said, we are spending so much resources in baseline, on developing the central forecast. We don't have time to to develop alternative forecasts. And this is exactly what we meant. And in my previous position, I was the head of the macro at the Central Bank of Armenia. So I always got complaints from board members, rightly so, that, we never have a time to discuss their scenarios that they have in their mind. So we basically put them in a box, talking about the central forecast 90% of the time. And, there is never a time to really discuss some alternatives. So I think this is something which was very, very important. And I was very glad to read it in the Bernanke's report as well. So I think when you put more emphasis on talking about the risks, it is actually creating much better environment for co-creation and resource utilization. So I thought this was very, very important. The thing which I thought that, is a bit different in terms of the path we take, and Bernanke was recommending, is really about the specialization of the staff. Because what Bernanke was recommending was to actually give more room for specialized staff in the selected areas, versus the approach that we took was a bit different, because we always had these specialized areas at the central bank. We actually did a switch in which we said, no, we want to have more universal economists who could actually discuss scenarios, have, better, they're, better situated in terms of talking to the board. They understand different areas rather than have these very specialized roles within the bank. And this, I think, is something which is worth considering, because we also, we're weighing different risks, because obviously on the one side, when you don't specialize so much, you risk to have basically lower quality research in that particular areas, because you lose this knowledge. But at the same time, we know that if you are too specialized, or your staff is too specialized, you don't rotate them too much, they don't discuss, they are not involved in different policy processes. We think that this is limiting their growth in terms of the being useful for the policy making. Because what we saw in our experience during last 15 years of doing for FPAS Mark 1 was really having people who were in the short-term forecasting, or forecasting inflation. They would be there for a long time, and so we would have these basically islands, and this was a problem. And here, I think the slide on Bob Solo is very relevant, and I think this is the approach that we took. This is a quote from Paul. This is a quote that we have on Bob Solo, which is, I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, but I'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model than without one. So I think what we want to do is to create an environment where we have these, well-rounded economists who can use models, which is very, very important. But at the same time, we don't want to overestimate the value of the specialized knowledge, which is important, but we don't want to we want our staff to develop in a richer environment, and they can actually talk about the narratives of the board. Because in our experience, maybe this is Armenia specific, the scarce resource is really to have economists who can take, who can organize this dialogue with the board members who have knowledge, but also they can, engage in a good dialogue with the board members in a way that they don't impose staff's ideas on the board, but they they use their idea to facilitate board's discussion. So this was much more difficult. In our case, I don't know Bank of England that well, so maybe this is something which is different. But I suggest Doug also talking about this issue, because I thought this was the biggest difference. In terms of the models, I think what Bernanke was suggesting also, was in line with what we are doing, because obviously I salute his emphasis on judgment in so many places in his report. I thought this is so important to hear from him, because the biggest myth that I have seen around the central banks is that somehow the decisions are spit out of the models with these nice lines. And I was very happy to see him, basically tackling that idea. The judgment is very important, but models are also very, very useful. And the approach that we were taking at the Central Bank of Armenia was really having a semi-structural, small, model, which was flexible enough to put the different narratives in a timely manner in it, but also having these, satellite models, which we call them, which focus on different aspects, migration or financial frictions, basically, which could be used at a certain moment if there is an interesting exercise or relevant, scenario that we want to make, but they are not part of this, small model, which has to be used at every forecasting round or projection round or the policy making round if you talk about FPAS Mark II. And the reason is that if in case you have so complicated models, as your main model for decision making, and you have all the bells and whistles, including financial frictions, which are extremely difficult to model, right? In that case, the technical exercise becomes so frustrating for the staff that it basically puts all the stress again on that constructing the lines, and you don't talk about the the scenarios. And this is the approach that we were taking. I thought I don't know what Bernanke was thinking about in terms of the practical implementation, because he put lots of emphasis on financial frictions, sectorial knowledge, and as far as I understood, he's not recommending to put that all in one big model and use that for operations. And if I understood him correctly, then we couldn't agree more. I thought this was a very good recommendation in a sense to have this small environment, which is well controlled, which is well suited to put the narratives, but then you have these specialized different models to talk about more complicated dynamics. So I thought that's also very, very important. I think I'm gonna stop here because these were the main aspects which were important for me reading Bernanke's report, and I thought I gave the parallels between what we are doing and what he was recommending for the Bank of England. Overall, great impression from the report. I think this is going to be a game changer, really important contribution for practical monetary policy making for years to come. And I'll stop here. Thanks very much.
So I'll agree with Armen. Thanks for the question at the last moment, as well regarding specialization and human capital. I guess I would start off the top by saying this shouldn't be a once in a lifetime affair. This should happen on a regular basis. I would say 5 years. There should be a review of the framework. One of the things I like about the Central Bank of Armenia and especially the Central Bank of Armenia is this idea of having a symposium once a year where you get feedback and then you work for the next year on developing the framework, in their case probably incrementally, because they've managed to get something going and so on. Now the actual framework that we created, like the analytical framework and the policymaking framework, is documented in a book. In the book is very comprehensive. It talks about everything, and it's my hope that that book gets updated every year, that the documentation of the models never falls out of date like it has in many central banks, including the Bank of England. Like the last documentation for the model that they use, which the Bernanke report says they've de-emphasized. So this is Compass. It's effectively a DSGE model. When one looks at the calibration of the model, I think it's 2011 and so on, and one looks at the transmission mechanisms, it's just way too fast. The expectational mechanisms are too powerful. The economy, the real world just doesn't respond that way. So it should definitely be de-emphasized. And in addition to that, Bernanke's right, they need to have more seasoned economists, okay, that are making those kinds of decisions about the analytical framework. And in addition to that, they have to find somebody that is good enough that they can command the respect of the board to lead them through this process. Because now that the problems have been revealed, there is going to be pressure to start making improvements in the short run. Now, the Bank of England gave a response immediately to the Bernanke report, saying that they will respond to all 12 recommendations and they will provide an update at the end of this year. So I think that would be my big picture thing. Now, regarding specialization and the Central Bank of Armenia. So obviously the degree of specialization will depend to a large extent on the resources that you have available. Okay, so the way that we have defined FPAS Mark II, think of a small central bank with very limited resources. Okay, so obviously you're not going to be able to go quite so deep on every issue than if you're talking about the Fed, where they hire the top PhDs from Ivy League schools and let them do research for several years, publishing papers and so on. And then some people in that group go into the policymaking sphere and others stay in the research sphere for, so the Fed is pulling from a population in the profession that is very special. Okay, so I would caution taking too much advice from those kinds of experience where you're dealing with advanced economy central banks. Now, I just want to go back to my first experience doing this, which was at the Bank of Canada in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Doug, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
All right, I want to tell you what the problems were. So the way the Bank of Canada was organized when I first went there as a young economist is that you had all these people doing current analysis. Okay, so I was hired as the consumption specialist. And then we would have a coordination group, an international department, a monetary department. And so you can see in that kind of world where there's all this specialization, there's big coordination problems. Okay. And in fact, the Bank of Canada, after I moved around from job to job to job, hired me to coordinate the Canadian projection process. And then having done that, they asked me to develop an analytical framework that would be more consistent with how we thought about monetary policy, because the old style econometric model that we were using wasn't equipped to deal with the kind of control problem that we were thinking about. So I then went to the IMF, having developed that framework at the Bank of Canada, along with Bob Tetlow. Bob went to the Fed, the board, and is one of the team on the board that basically works on FPAS and policy-related issues. And of David Rose, another third mention, who then retired. Now, what problem did we have? Exactly the same problem that people at the Bank of England will face right now. Can somebody develop a plan, okay, train people that basically can design a system and then implement it in a way where the Monetary Policy Committee feels like they are very informed about what is going on in the economy, and they're very informed about the various issues using a model-based approach. Okay, so I think now, so how much specialization? Well, the Bernanke recommendations talks about experience. And so when you think about that from a central bank perspective, is that just the length of time, that a person is in the job, or are there training methods that can be used to learn faster? And that's obviously what we're trying at the Central Bank of Armenia by investing.
Doug, you're muted again.
So that new staff have up to 1 year to become trained. In other words, to develop enough experience to actually enter the system and start contributing to the construction of scenarios, the current analysis, the production of the monetary policy report. Now, I'll tell you one secret that we've learned, and that is to start thinking about applying the framework to as many countries and as many institutional frameworks as we can, because the more that we think about other country experiences, the more information we will have for thinking about, how the economy works, what communication strategies are successful and unsuccessful, and so on. So what we've done here, our current group of level 1 students include 3 Armenians and 3 Georgians. And how are they learning this stuff? They are applying it to the UK, to the Euro area, to Canada, to try and develop as much experience as possible, learning how to calibrate the models and estimate the models and implement FPAS Mark II in these various country situations. So I think that to answer the question of specialization, now the framework that we've developed, Hai Kabetsian, who's the head of the macro directorate at the Central Bank of Armenia, he'll be talking about, how we have 4 groups of 6, that you can't really get anything done if you have more than 6 people. Okay, that 6 is the right amount of people to basically do everything. But then to have another group of 6 people that are backing them up, and then of course 2 other groups of 6 people that are doing research and specializing in the areas that are, relevant for monetary policy. So, those areas are things like solving mixed complementarity problems. These are non-linearities. These are pretty specialized. So, while I might say that, Armen, that our, economists are generalists and that understand, how to do everything, they are more specialized in the areas of solving nonlinear models than I would say most central banks in the world, perhaps with the exception of the Fed, the people at the board and so on. So that would be my reflections about specialization and human capital. We'll be talking about these issues in much greater detail. Bob Ford and I are going to be going through the 12 recommendations in detail and, talking about various perspectives about, how big should the model be? How do you differentiate a research program from a model? Because it seems a little unclear in the report. Would you want to put everything in the world in the model? It sounds like the wish list includes virtually everything you can imagine. So there's questions about that, about how to think about, what are the appropriate types of models for coordinating a projection process and so on. So I'll leave it there, but those would be my remarks on specialization.
Right, Doug and Armen, thank you so much for that interesting overview. I think partially of the points actually made by Bernanke in the report, how it relates to the work being done at the Central Bank of Armenia, at the Central Bank of Canada before that, and how to actually train new staff by having them look at various countries, which I myself also find a very good way of doing economics, because then you see all of these scenarios, which you can then use to make scenario analysis about your own country. And finally, also good, I think, that you pointed out that even though there are many similarities, there are some differences. For example, in your two approaches between you and Bernanke when it comes to focusing on specialists and generalists. Next up, we have Shalva Mkhatriashvili from the National Bank of Georgia now about their implementation of FPAS.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for including us. So this is indeed very interesting review for us to take stock, to learn something, to like apply some these kind of ideas. But as it matters, this is things that we've also thought about even before. And I would like to emphasize one key thing that, if you ask me, was kind of a quietly screaming from Bernanke review, and this was about publishing or at least somehow basing forecasts on endogenous monetary policy rate. So we've discussed the importance of scenarios, importance of stuff, but I think the importance of scenarios is to some extent also caused by this need for Bank of England to base its monetary policy making more on endogenously determined interest rates relative to exogenously given interest rates to their central projection in the form of either constant interest rates or in the form of market reference scenarios. So I think, and this is my personal view, it seems like the Bank of England is still at this stage not ready to somehow introduce this endogenous monetary policy into its communication. So that my impression would be that's why Ben Bernanke was not explicit about this. But again, if you read the report between the lines, it kind of quietly screams that having monetary policy endogenous in your analysis is very important, and that's why he probably started by discussing why do we need forecasts at all? Why central banks need forecasts at all? That sounds trivial question, but when you are a central bank, the need for forecasts comes solely from you using it for policy formulation. And when you formulate policy, this helps you make decisions because your decisions affect the future, and you need to have some idea about the future. But why do we provide forecasts to the market? Well, again, because they should be able to understand our policy intentions. So that's the bottom line, and that's what's shown on this slide here. This is actually key part of FPAS. Not only understanding where the economy is now and what are the driving forces, which is very well done in central banks like Bank of England, but the key reason why we need answers to these first two questions is to have an idea what we need to do with our policy instruments, and that's actually what's lacking. And I think one of the key reasons why Bernanke emphasizes scenarios so much is to somehow find this kind of a backdoor way of introducing or reintroducing these endogenous monetary policy discussions within Bank of England communications. And that's why he's saying that we need scenarios because they provide the public central bank's reaction function. That's the key reason why we actually provide forecasts at all. And if you provide forecast that says nothing about central bank's reaction function, then this forecast may not be serving any purpose when it comes to central bank. Also, these scenarios helps central bank to communicate what it will be doing with its instruments if there are some major risks down the road. That's again the risks, the risk management approach that Bernanke also emphasized. That sometimes central banks want to, and quote unquote, ensure against bad outcomes, and that also comes down to communicating what he will be doing with their policy instruments. So this need for endogeneity, like endogenous monetary policy in your communication, is clear to me from this report. But again, it was not very explicit because of probably the Bank of England not being ready yet to have these discussions, and that's why they kind of deferred these to future discussions. And by the way, I liked one of the parts where Bernanke actually emphasizes this need for endogeneity, and this is actually also based on Charles's earlier research. And he's saying again, quote unquote, if the MPC policy action and communication cause the market curve to shift, as it likely will if the policy action deviates from market expectations, then the market-based conditioning assumption becomes immediately out of date. So this seems like if policy is trying to influence the market, then by implication you always run this risk that your forecast will be simply irrelevant because you want to affect market pricing of your future actions. And if you are successful in doing this, then your own forecast, which is based on previous market expectation of policy rate, becomes out of date. So that's kind of a tail wagging the dog kind of scenario when it's the central banks should be with their forecast communication, should be trying to influence, to nudge market expected interest rates to make sure that with this, they achieve their objectives. So my bottom line is that having this endogenous monetary policy in communication is very important, but because of kind of a difficulty to introduce or to switch to this kind of communication, kind of a constraints this report to be explicit about it. But again, my own take is that if you read between the lines, it's clear that this endogenous policy, monetary policy analysis, endogenous policy in communication is something that will be very much recommended by this report. This has been our experience as well. We've been actually using FPAS for quite some time, and we actually have started using forecasts of our policy rate, our endogenous forecasts of policy rate being published as early as 2016. Since then, we've been publishing this policy rate forecast every quarter, and this has helped us quite a bit to communicate to the market what kind of reaction function we have. And this helps in terms of making sure that the market adjusts quickly when new information comes and adjusts in a way that's consistent with our own objectives. So I can give you one example. Last year when we had a policy tightened, historically tightest policy, since we switched to inflation targeting in 2009, we were communicating that we will maintain policy rate tight for some time, even though headline inflation had already dropped below the target. So our kind of idea was to make sure that we maintain policy tight as long as necessary to make sure that long-term inflation expectations are re-anchored back again to the target, even if we run this current inflation being below target. So this was kind of a risk management approach, which is also implicit in Bernanke's review. But this was something that we did within our FPAS with the policy rate communication being explicit. So later, when we kind of maintained this tight policy, it seemed that inflation remained below target for quite some time. And this helped in terms of anchoring inflation expectations. And then the market was actually pretty quick to acknowledge this fact, and they had policy rate cuts expected even before we communicated them to happen. And later, actually, turned out that the market was right. Then we did follow suit with pretty significant interest rate cuts, and inflation is still remaining below the target. So this kind of making sure that the market understands how you behave, how you try to manage risks, and how you react to different kind of information coming in, then that makes the system more efficient, and actually it also helps your policy to achieve your objectives more efficiently. So again, the simple way I would summarize is to somehow push this discussion towards recognizing that communicating explicitly about interest rates that's consistent with our objectives, or to make it technically, to endogenize monetary policy in our models is something that should also be discussed. And that's, I think, the way to go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that contribution, talking about an aspect that I haven't talked about yet of Bernanke's review, which is the importance of endogenous rates in the forecast of the central bank. That is not a fixed rate or not the market rate, but the rate that the central bank itself expects to set. Yeah, thank you so much. I think with that, we're ready for the final contribution here before we head to the Q&A, and that is from Professor Charles Goodhart.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to make just about 4 fairly quick comments. My first one is that I want to give very sincere and considerable congratulations to Doug and all of you for having adopted the FPAS, because what Bernanke has actually been saying is that the FPAS approach is pretty much what he's advocating, including, as Armen suggested, much less of an emphasis on the baseline. Now, one of the problems, if you want to put much less emphasis on the baseline, is how actually do you de-emphasize this? And here I think that the approach that you've been using is in some ways sort of rather in advance of what Bernanke suggested, because what you're suggesting is using a market reference scenario, which actually, in this important sense, is aiming to say that we're not telling you anything new. This is simply what the market actually believes will happen. So this is simply a reflection of what you already think. And in no sense, as far as I can understand, does the market reference scenario imply that that rate would be necessarily officially adopted. And this then goes into my sort of next question, which is one of the things that Bernanke leaves open, and leaves open intentionally, is whether the de-emphasized central projection should be based on an officially agreed path of interest rates, or as the market reference scenario has, simply on market expectations. The more you relate the central projection to an officially agreed path, the less anyone outside is ever going to take any notice of your scenarios, because they'll just assume that the central projection is what is expected, and that will determine their own expectations, their own portfolio positions, etc., etc. But this is going to remain, after Bernanke, the key question. Should a de-emphasized central projection be officially adopted, or just a reflection of the market? My own hope is the latter, but it's going to be a very, very deep discussion on that point. The other thing which neither I think that you, at least as far as I can understand, nor Bernanke has actually said very much about, is how on earth do you choose the scenarios? And obviously one is more and one is less, but there are a whole series of various scenarios. There are a huge number of risks. And there are 2 aspects about the choice of scenario that sort of worry me particularly. The first is that you don't know how things are going to develop. Statistics are always very volatile and get frequently revised very considerably, which means that when you say are moving into the higher inflation risk, you don't actually know that that is what you're moving into for some time. So the central bank does not have foresight of the risk until after it actually has occurred. And so when you do your scenario, how delayed do you actually have the endogenous response of the central bank? Another issue that worries me is that many of the risks are, in a sense, political. I don't know, if we look into the future, a huge risk coming up is who's going to win the American presidential election. Now, can you actually have a scenario of Biden winning or Trump winning? And that's politically sensitive. Another great concern is what's going to happen with the present procedure of deficits and debt, making the projection for debt unsustainable. Can you have scenarios which relate to fiscal policy, which are, after all, they're key risks for a central bank? But can you have scenarios for that? So there's very little in Bernanke, and I haven't seen that much in the FPAS about how you actually go about choosing and justifying the choice of scenarios. So I think we're left with two sort of great sort of issues, which Bernanke has really not said very much about, which is, should the de-emphasized central projection be simply a reflection of the market, or should it have any official justification in it? And the second one is, how on earth are you going to choose your scenarios? But let me end by saying that Bernanke has gone an awfully long way towards accepting really the whole procedures and mechanisms and proposals of FPAS. And so I can only end by congratulating all of you on what I think is actually a great success for you.